In the ruins of ancient Alexandria, historians uncovered records of merchants who refused to enter agreements with men known for spirit of emptiness. These men were not always poor, some even possessed gold. But the elders believed their inner condition carried an invisible disorder that eventually destroyed every opportunity placed before them. Strangely, modern psychology now echoes the same truth. Many people lose wealth long before they lose money. They lose it in thought. Tonight, you will uncover the forgotten energy law ancient Hermetic teachers, Stoic philosophers, and sacred wisdom traditions believed governed prosperity itself. You will discover why two people can work equally hard, yet one continually rises while the other remains trapped in cycles of lack. The ancients believed wealth was never only material, it was energetic first. And once you understand how consciousness shapes your relationship with abundance, scarcity begins to lose its authority over you. Chapter 1. The first law of wealth consciousness. What if the greatest obstacle between you and abundance is not the economy, your background, or even your circumstances, but the invisible atmosphere of thought you carry within yourself every single day? Thousands of years ago, Hermetic initiates in Egypt taught a principle so guarded that it was whispered only within temple chambers lit by oil lamps and silence. The teaching later appeared in the Kybalion as one of the foundational laws of reality itself, as within, so without. To the modern ear it sounds poetic, but to the ancients it was practical law. They believed the outer conditions of life gradually mirrored the dominant condition of consciousness within a person. This did not mean thoughts magically produced gold from the air. The ancients were not naive dreamers. They understood labor, trade, discipline, and strategy, but they also observed something unsettling across generations. People carrying deep internal scarcity often destroyed opportunities. Even when fortune arrived directly at their door, ports repeat silently. An old Hermetic story tells of two merchants who traveled together across the desert roads between Egypt and Phoenicia. Both men carried equal goods, equal camels, and equal opportunity. Yet one merchant constantly feared betrayal, loss, and disaster. Every negotiation made him tense. Every delay filled him with suspicion. When offered partnerships, he hesitated. When profit appeared, he expected collapse. His mind remained fixed upon loss long before loss arrived. The second merchant behaved differently. He remained attentive but calm. He prepared carefully, spoke clearly, and expected solutions rather than catastrophe. He still encountered storms, dishonest traders, and setbacks, yet he moved through them with steadiness rather than panic. Years later, one became prosperous while the other descended into bitterness and debt. The temple teachers used this story to explain a hidden principle. Consciousness shapes behavior before behavior shapes destiny. The outer world slowly organizes itself around the inner assumptions a person repeatedly carries. A man convinced opportunities are dangerous unconsciously rejects them. A person secretly ashamed of wealth often sabotages success once it appears. Someone who believes abundance belongs only to others rarely notices the doors standing quietly in front of them. The invisible becomes visible. Even now, modern life reflects this ancient law constantly. Consider two individuals entering the same business meeting. One arrives carrying desperation, fear, and internal tension. The other arrives with grounded confidence and clarity. Their words may sound similar, yet people instinctively respond differently to each of them. One radiates contraction. The other radiates steadiness. Energy speaks before language. The Hermetic initiates believed every thought repeated consistently becomes a subtle form of mental atmosphere. Over time, this atmosphere influences decisions, relationships, perception, timing, and emotional resilience. Eventually, what was once invisible begins appearing externally as recurring life conditions. This is why some people remain trapped in financial struggle even after receiving opportunities others would have transformed into abundance. Their consciousness remains loyal to lack, and the mind always seeks evidence to confirm its deepest assumptions. A wealthy Roman Stoic once wrote that poverty is not merely the absence of money, but the constant expectation of loss. That sentence reveals an uncomfortable truth many spend their entire lives avoiding. Some people live in scarcity even while possessing abundance because fear dominates their perception. Others possess very little materially, yet move with such inner stability that opportunities eventually gather around them naturally. Inner state precedes outer form. The ancient Hermetic merchants understood this so deeply that many practiced rituals before conducting trade. Contrary to modern stereotypes, these rituals were not primitive superstitions. They were methods of mental conditioning. Before entering negotiations, merchants would sit quietly to calm emotional turbulence. Some repeated sacred phrases reminding themselves that panic clouds judgment. Others organized their marketplace carefully because external order reinforced internal clarity. They understood something modern culture often forgets. Disorder attracts disorder. Look carefully at moments when your financial decisions became destructive. Often it was not lack of intelligence that caused harm. It was emotional chaos, panic spending, fear-based avoidance, desperation, envy, shame. The ancients believed these states fragmented the mind and weakened perception creates weakened outcomes. A farmer from ancient Judea once visited a teacher known for unusual wisdom regarding prosperity. The farmer complained endlessly about his failing crops and financial hardship. After listening quietly, the teacher asked a strange question. When abundance approaches you, do you welcome it or distrust it? The farmer laughed nervously but could not answer. The teacher then explained that many people pray for prosperity while unconsciously fearing responsibility, visibility, change, or judgment. Their conscious mind seeks wealth while their deeper emotional state resists it. This creates contradiction, and contradiction weakens action. That contradiction still exists today. Many people say they desire abundance, yet internally associate money with corruption, anxiety, exhaustion, greed, or guilt. Then they wonder why opportunities feel distant. The mind protects itself from what it secretly believes is dangerous. The first law of wealth consciousness is not merely about earning more, it is about becoming internally compatible with abundance. This is why guarding your internal dialogue matters so profoundly. Every repeated statement becomes instruction to the subconscious mind. I never have enough. Money always disappears. People like me struggle financially. These phrases seem harmless when spoken casually, yet repeated over years they become psychological architecture. The walls become invisible. The ancients warned that thoughts repeated emotionally eventually become identity, and identity quietly shapes behavior every single day. A person who identifies with lack notices obstacles more quickly than opportunity. A person who identifies with capability moves differently through uncertainty. So tonight, begin observing your internal language carefully, not with guilt, not with forced positivity, but with awareness. Awareness changes everything. Because the moment you recognize scarcity thinking operating automatically within you, the pattern begins losing unconscious power. And according to the Hermetic teachers, that is the moment real transformation begins. Chapter 2. Why some people repel wealth. Here is one of the strangest truths ever discovered by ancient philosophers. Many people unconsciously push prosperity away while consciously chasing it with all their strength. At first, this sounds impossible. Why would anyone reject the very thing they desperately desire? Yet the Stoics, Hermetic mystics, and early spiritual teachers repeatedly warned that hidden emotional conflict creates energetic disorder within the human mind, and disorder distorts behavior in ways most people never notice. The contradiction lives beneath awareness. A surprising number of people carry emotional shame around money itself. Some were raised hearing wealth described as dangerous, selfish, corrupting, or immoral. Others witnessed conflict, betrayal, or fear surrounding finances during childhood. Over time, the nervous system quietly linked money with emotional pain. Years later, these individuals still pursue success externally while unconsciously fearing it internally. The Stoic philosophers understood this dynamic well. Marcus Aurelius ruled Rome during periods of war, plague, political betrayal, and economic instability. Yet throughout his writings in Meditations, he repeatedly returned to one principle. External events do not destroy a person nearly as much as uncontrolled emotional reactions do. Emotional chaos blinds judgment. Imagine a sailor caught in violent waters. If panic overtakes him, he loses the ability to navigate correctly. The storm becomes more dangerous because his inner state collapses. Stoic philosophy taught that financial hardship often operates similarly. Fear narrows thinking, shame weakens confidence, desperation destroys timing, and poor timing destroys opportunity. An old story from Athens tells of a gifted craftsman who spent years struggling financially despite possessing extraordinary skill. Every time success approached, he found a way to ruin it. He argued with patrons, delayed important decisions, and abandoned profitable opportunities at the last moment. Eventually, an older Stoic teacher asked him privately, "What emotion rises in you when prosperity comes close?" The craftsman admitted something painful. He feared becoming visible. Wealth felt dangerous because he associated success with criticism, envy, and pressure. His subconscious mind viewed prosperity not as safety, but as threat. That realization changed his life. For the first time, he understood that his struggle was not purely economic. It was psychological and emotional. His inner resistance had been quietly sabotaging his outer results for years. Many people still live this exact pattern today. Some fear losing money so intensely they avoid investment, growth, or opportunity altogether. Others spend compulsively because scarcity creates emotional anxiety. Some overwork endlessly because they subconsciously believe rest makes them unworthy of abundance. Others sabotage progress the moment stability begins appearing. The pattern changes form, but the energy underneath remains the same. The ancients believed wealth flows most naturally toward internal steadiness. Not arrogance, not greed, not obsession, steadiness. A calm relationship with resources creates clearer decisions, stronger perception, healthier timing, and greater resilience during uncertainty. Panic repels clarity. This is why emotional neutrality becomes a form of energetic armor. When financial difficulty appears, the untrained mind spirals immediately into catastrophe. But disciplined awareness interrupts the spiral before it gains momentum. A Stoic teacher once wrote, "You suffer more in imagination than reality." Financial fear often proves this true. People destroy their peace imagining future disasters that never arrive. Meanwhile, their anxiety weakens the very perception needed to solve present problems intelligently. The nervous system shapes behavior, and behavior shapes results. So the ancient solution was never blind optimism. It was emotional mastery. Observe fear without obeying it. Notice shame without building identity around it. Watch scarcity thoughts arise without feeding them constantly through repetition, because whatever the mind rehearses emotionally begins feeling true. And whatever feels true eventually shapes action. Tonight, begin practicing a simple but powerful discipline. Whenever panic arises around money, pause before reacting. Breathe slowly. Observe the emotion without immediately believing its story. Then ask yourself one question. Am I responding from clarity or from fear? That single moment of awareness may prevent years of unconscious self-sabotage. The ancients understood this deeply. Wealth is not only attracted through effort, it is sustained through inner order. An ancient teacher once told his students that poverty does not always begin with an empty hand. Sometimes it begins with a closed spirit. He warned that two men could receive the same opportunity, the same land, the same silver, and still arrive at completely different destinies, because one multiplies what he is given while the other hides from responsibility through fear. For centuries, this sounded like spiritual poetry. Now psychology calls it behavioral conditioning. The ancients simply called it law. Chapter 3, the parable of the three servants. Long before modern books spoke about wealth consciousness, an ancient story appeared in sacred scripture describing three servants entrusted with resources by a wealthy master before he departed on a distant journey. At first glance, the story seems simple, but hidden within it is one of the oldest psychological teachings ever preserved about money, fear, and human potential. The story became known as the parable of the talents. The master gave each servant a different portion of wealth according to their ability. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to the third only 1. In the ancient world, a talent represented enormous value, something far greater than a few coins. It symbolized opportunity, responsibility, and entrusted power. The first servant multiplied what he received. The second did the same. But the third became consumed by fear. Instead of using what was placed in his hands, he buried it in the ground to avoid risk, failure, or loss. When the master returned, the servant defended himself by saying he acted out of caution. But beneath caution was fear, and fear had produced stagnation. The ancients understood this parable as far more than a lesson about finance. It was a revelation about consciousness itself. The servant who buried his talent did not merely lack skill, he lacked inner trust. His fear distorted perception until preservation became more important than growth. Rather than multiplying life, he retreated from it. Fear freezes movement. Even today, countless people unknowingly live inside this exact psychological pattern. Some bury their talents beneath procrastination. Others hide opportunity beneath endless overthinking. Some cling so tightly to security that they slowly suffocate possibility itself. They tell themselves they are being realistic, practical, or cautious, while internally fear governs every decision. The result is invisible stagnation. Ancient wisdom traditions repeatedly warned that wealth grows where responsibility grows. The person who respects, develops, and wisely directs what they already possess gradually becomes capable of holding more. Meanwhile, the person who neglects small responsibilities unconsciously weakens their relationship with abundance itself. This principle appears everywhere in life. A man who cannot manage a little often struggles when given much. A person who constantly disrespects small opportunities rarely recognizes larger ones when they arrive. The mind forms habits around stewardship long before material conditions change. The pattern begins internally. An old desert story tells of a young trader who traveled to study under an aging merchant famous for unusual prosperity. Expecting to learn secret investment strategies, the young man instead found the elder carefully organizing tiny items in his small marketplace each morning with extraordinary attention. The young trader laughed. "Why spend so much care on little things?" The old merchant looked at him quietly and replied, "Because disorder in small things becomes disorder in large things." That sentence followed the young man for years. Eventually he realized the elder was teaching far more than cleanliness or organization. He was teaching energetic relationship. Respect invites multiplication. Neglect invites decay. The way a person handles small responsibilities reflects the state of consciousness they carry toward life itself. Wealth notices attention. The Stoics taught something remarkably similar. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a disciplined life is built not through dramatic moments, but through repeated acts of conscious order. The ancients understood that chaos within the mind eventually appears. Externally, through scattered behavior, impulsive decisions, emotional reactions, and weakened perception, order strengthens creation. Consider how many people unconsciously disrespect what they already possess while begging life for more. They misuse time, neglect skills, waste opportunities, avoid discipline, and ignore responsibilities. Then they wonder why abundance feels distant. Yet according to ancient wisdom, consciousness is always being trained by daily behavior. Every action teaches the mind what you believe you deserve. This is why stewardship is energetic before it becomes financial. The person who treats their current resources, however small, with clarity, care, and gratitude develops an inner structure capable of sustaining future abundance. Meanwhile, fear-based oids slowly weakens confidence, perception, and initiative. The buried talent becomes symbolic, not only of money, but of human potential itself. There is another layer hidden inside this ancient parable that older wisdom traditions understood deeply. Movement creates multiplication. Life itself operates through circulation. Seeds must be planted, water must flow, breath must move. Energy stagnates when imprisoned by fear. So does prosperity. The servant who buried his talent believed safety would protect him. But in trying to avoid loss entirely, he also avoided growth. Many people still do this emotionally. They refuse opportunities because uncertainty frightens them. They silence their ambitions because failure feels unbearable. They avoid learning because ignorance feels temporarily safer than transformation. But buried energy decays. A wealthy philosopher once wrote that abundance rarely enters the life of a person who fears responsibility more than limitation. That sentence explains why some remain trapped for decades in the same financial and emotional patterns. Responsibility demands growth, fear demands retreat, and the two cannot rule the mind simultaneously. The ancients believed prosperity was not merely about accumulation, it was about expansion of consciousness. A person capable of multiplying wisdom, discipline, generosity, perception, and self-command eventually multiplies opportunities as well. External conditions often follow internal development gradually and invisibly at first, until one day the difference becomes undeniable. The law appears slow, until suddenly it appears obvious. So tonight, look honestly at what has already been placed into your hands. Your time, your energy, your abilities. your relationships, your attention, your current resources? Do you treat them as burdens or entrusted potential? Because according to this ancient wisdom, the future often grows from whatever you consistently honor in the present. Treat small things carefully. Large things begin there. Chapter 4. The Hidden Energy of Gratitude. A poor farmer once traveled across dry hills to visit a teacher known for helping weary people rebuild their lives after hardship. The farmer expected instructions about trade, labor, or survival. Instead, the teacher handed him a small, empty bowl and said, "For 30 days, each morning place one thing into this bowl that reminds you life has not abandoned you." The farmer left confused. He needed money, not symbolism, but reluctantly he obeyed. On the first morning, he placed a piece of bread inside. The next day, a small olive branch from his field. Later, a note containing the name of his daughter. Then a smooth stone from the river where he once played as a child. Day after day, the bowl slowly filled with reminders that even amid hardship, existence still contained provision, beauty, relationship, memory, and possibility. Something unexpected happened. The farmer's mind began changing. The ancients understood gratitude differently than modern motivational slogans often present it. To them, gratitude was not denial of hardship. It was a discipline of perception, a method of training consciousness to recognize opportunity, stability, and provision instead of becoming hypnotized entirely by lack. What the mind repeatedly notices, it strengthens. The book of Proverbs repeatedly connects wisdom, gratitude, discipline, and prosperity together. Ancient teachers observed that scarcity consciousness narrows perception dramatically. A fearful mind becomes obsessed with what is missing. Eventually, this obsession blinds a person to resources, opportunities, relationships, and possibilities already surrounding them. Scarcity shrinks vision. Modern psychology now confirms something similar. Under chronic stress and financial fear, human cognition becomes narrower and more reactive. Creativity weakens, long-term thinking decreases, problem-solving deteriorates. The nervous system becomes trapped in survival mode. The ancients discovered this without laboratories. They simply observed life carefully. A grateful mind behaves differently from a fearful one. It sees options where panic sees walls. It notices openings where shame sees defeat. Gratitude stabilizes emotional energy, allowing clearer judgment and healthier decisions during uncertainty, and clarity changes outcomes. This is why many ancient spiritual traditions practiced daily rituals of thanks even during difficulty. Not because suffering was imaginary, but because consciousness required protection. They understood the mind naturally drifts toward fear unless intentionally trained otherwise. Attention becomes destiny. A merchant from ancient Judea once lost nearly everything during a season of famine. While others around him collapsed emotionally, he maintained unusual calm. When asked how he remained steady, he explained that each evening he deliberately listed what still remained instead of obsessing over what was lost. "My mind cannot build from despair," he said quietly. That sentence carries ancient wisdom. Many people unknowingly strengthen scarcity every day through constant complaint, comparison, resentment, and fear-focused attention. Their awareness becomes magnetized toward absence. Over time, emotional exhaustion replaces clarity, and exhausted minds make poor decisions. The hidden energy of gratitude is not mystical fantasy. It is psychological alignment. Gratitude interrupts panic. It widens perception. It restores emotional balance. It reminds the nervous system that possibility still exists. From that state, behavior improves naturally, and improved behavior changes life gradually. The Taoist sages taught that life flows most powerfully through openness rather than contraction. Gratitude creates openness internally. Fear creates contraction. One expands awareness, the other compresses it. You can feel the difference immediately. Think of someone consumed entirely by bitterness and resentment. Their energy becomes heavy, rigid, exhausting. Opportunities feel threatening. Relationships weaken, creativity disappears. Now think of someone who remains deeply grateful even during hardship. Their presence carries steadiness. Solutions appear more naturally around them because their perception remains alive instead of paralyzed. The internal state changes everything. Ancient Hermetic teachers believed gratitude harmonized human consciousness with abundance itself. Not because the universe rewarded politeness, but because gratitude dissolved the blindness created by chronic lack-focused thinking. Where attention rests, energy follows, and where energy flows repeatedly, patterns form. So tonight, begin a simple ritual before sleep. Write down 3 forms of provision already present in your life. Not fantasies, not future dreams, present realities. Food, breath, friendship, knowledge, shelter, opportunity, experience, strength gained through hardship. Train perception deliberately, because the mind that only sees emptiness eventually creates more of it. But the mind trained to recognize existing provision becomes capable of recognizing emerging opportunity as well. The ancients understood this deeply. Gratitude does not magically create wealth overnight, but it creates the inner condition from which wiser action, clearer perception, stronger resilience, and healthier prosperity can finally grow. Chapter 5. The Stoic Secret of Financial Calm. Imagine standing inside Rome while rumors of plague move through the streets like smoke. Merchants close their shops early. Families whisper behind locked doors. Soldiers return exhausted from distant wars. Grain prices rise without warning. Fear spreads faster than disease itself. And at the center of this storm sat a man carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders, Marcus Aurelius. History remembers him as a Roman emperor, but the deeper reason his writings survived for centuries is because he mastered something more difficult than ruling armies. He learned to govern his own mind during chaos. That is rare power. Most people imagine wealth begins through strategy alone. Yet the Stoics taught a radically different truth. Before a person can manage money wisely, they must first learn to manage emotion wisely. Because panic distorts perception, fear weakens judgment, and emotional chaos quietly destroys intelligent action long before external collapse appears. A frightened mind cannot see clearly. Marcus Aurelius understood this intimately. During his reign, Rome endured military conflict, betrayal, economic instability, and one of the deadliest plagues in ancient history. Yet throughout his private writings in Meditations, he returned repeatedly to the same principle. External events possess less power over human beings than uncontrolled internal reactions. That insight becomes especially important during financial hardship. An old Stoic teacher once compared fear to muddy water. The more violently a person stirs it, the less clearly they can see the bottom. But if the water becomes still, clarity slowly returns on its own. Financial panic operates exactly the same way. Consider how many destructive decisions emerge from emotional overwhelm rather than rational thinking. People invest impulsively because greed blinds caution. Others avoid opportunity entirely because fear magnifies danger. Some spend recklessly to soothe anxiety. Others freeze completely, unable to act at all. Emotion begins steering perception, and perception begins steering destiny. A wealthy Roman merchant once lost nearly half his trading fleet during a violent Mediterranean storm. News spread rapidly through the city that his fortune was finished. Competitors celebrated quietly. Friends expected emotional collapse. But witnesses described something strange. The merchant remained calm. Not emotionless, not indifferent, calm. When asked how he avoided panic after such devastating loss, he reportedly answered, "If I lose command of my mind also, then I have lost more than ships." That sentence contains ancient wisdom. The Stoics believed inner stability was a greater form of wealth than temporary external possession because it preserved the ability to rebuild. A person overwhelmed by fear becomes internally fragmented. Their thinking narrows, their timing weakens, their awareness collapses into survival mode, and survival mode rarely creates abundance. Modern neuroscience now confirms much of what these ancient philosophers observed intuitively. Under intense emotional stress, the brain shifts toward reactive behavior patterns. Creativity decreases. Long-term planning weakens. Problem-solving becomes distorted by perceived threat. The ancients discovered this through observation alone. They noticed that calm individuals consistently navigated difficulty more effectively than emotionally reactive ones. Not because calmness magically removed hardship, but because steadiness preserved perception during uncertainty. Clarity becomes advantage. An ancient Stoic exercise involved imagining loss before it occurred. At first glance, this sounds pessimistic, but the purpose was psychological resilience. By mentally rehearsing uncertainty calmly, practitioners weakened fear's ability to dominate them emotionally when difficulties actually appeared. They trained emotional endurance deliberately. Today, many people do the opposite. They rehearse catastrophe unconsciously every day through anxiety, endless news consumption, financial fear, and imagined disaster scenarios. Their nervous system remains trapped in constant tension. Eventually, this chronic stress shapes behavior itself. The body obeys the mind. A businessman from Alexandria once visited an aging Stoic philosopher after suffering repeated financial failures. He complained bitterly about markets, politics, dishonest competitors, and bad luck. The philosopher listened quietly before asking a simple question. "When uncertainty appears, what happens inside your mind first?" The man answered honestly. "Panic," the philosopher nodded slowly. "Then panic is your first poverty." That statement changed him forever, because he finally understood that external instability was not his only problem. His internal instability amplified every external challenge he faced. Fear caused rushed decisions. Anxiety weakened judgment. Emotional exhaustion distorted timing. The invisible was shaping the visible. This is why the Stoics valued stillness so deeply. Not passive inactivity, but disciplined composure. They believed the person who remained internally ordered during chaos possessed extraordinary power, because most human beings collapse emotionally under pressure. Calmness becomes rare, and rare qualities become valuable. There is another reason financial calm matters that ancient teachers understood clearly. People instinctively trust stability. In times of uncertainty, emotionally grounded individuals naturally become centers of influence. Their steadiness reassures others. Their clarity attracts cooperation. Their decisions carry greater weight because they are not driven by visible panic. Emotional discipline creates authority. You can observe this even in ordinary life. One person enters difficulty and immediately spreads fear, confusion, and emotional turbulence. Another enters the same situation calmly, thinks clearly, and begins finding solutions. The circumstances may be identical, yet the outcomes often diverge dramatically. Consciousness shapes response, and response shapes reality. The Stoics never taught suppression of emotion. They taught mastery over emotional domination. Fear may appear, anxiety may arise, but awareness interrupts automatic reaction before chaos takes control completely. That pause changes everything. So the next time financial uncertainty enters your life, resist the urge to react immediately from emotion. Pause first, breathe slowly. Observe the mind carefully before acting. Ask yourself whether your decisions are emerging from clarity or panic, because, according to the ancient Stoics, emotional discipline is not separate from prosperity. It is one of its hidden foundations. A calm mind sees opportunities panic overlooks, and in difficult times, perception itself becomes wealth. Chapter 6, The Law of Vibration and Money. Deep within the Hermetic traditions of Egypt and Greece existed a strange teaching that ancient initiates guarded carefully from the masses. They believed every human being carried an invisible field of mental and emotional energy, constantly shaping perception, behavior, relationships, and outcomes. They called this principle vibration. To modern ears, the word often sounds mystical or abstract, but the Hermetic teachers viewed it as practical law. According to the Kybalion, nothing in existence rests completely still. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. Thoughts vibrate. Emotions vibrate. Beliefs vibrate. Even silence carries quality and atmosphere, and human beings continuously broadcast their internal state into the world around them. The ancients believed money responded to this invisible atmosphere more than most people realized, not magically, energetically, and psychologically. An old Hermetic manuscript tells the story of two brothers who inherited equal land after their father's death. One brother constantly complained that fortune favored others unfairly. He expected failure before planting seeds. He distrusted opportunity. He spoke endlessly about scarcity, corruption, and limitation. Over time, his fields weakened from neglect because despair drained his motivation. The second brother behaved differently. He still experienced hardships, storms, and setbacks, yet he approached life with steadiness and expectation rather than defeat. He searched for possibilities instead of obsessing over obstacles. Gradually, his land prospered. The outer difference began internally. The Hermetic initiates believed repetitive thought and emotion create what we would now call identity. A scarcity identity constantly anticipates lack, danger, insufficiency, and disappointment. Because the mind seeks confirmation of its dominant beliefs, perception begins organizing itself around these assumptions. Eventually, the pattern feels permanent. A person carrying scarcity consciousness notices what is missing more quickly than what is possible. They speak differently, decide differently, react differently. Their nervous system remains tuned towards survival rather than creation. And over years, this invisible conditioning shapes life profoundly. Wealth consciousness, according to the ancients, was not greed or obsession with money. It was internal compatibility with abundance, a psychological and emotional state rooted in possibility, steadiness, receptivity, discipline, and trust in one's capacity to create value. Identity becomes signal, and signal influences behavior constantly. A fascinating story survives from an ancient trading city near the Mediterranean coast. A young apprentice once asked a wealthy merchant why some men attracted opportunity wherever they traveled, while others seemed surrounded by endless failure. The merchant answered carefully, "Because people reveal their relationship with life before they speak." The apprentice looked confused. So the merchant explained further. Some individuals radiate desperation, fear, envy, bitterness, or emotional exhaustion. Others carry steadiness, confidence, attentiveness, and calm expectation. Even without realizing it, human beings respond differently to each atmosphere. The invisible communicates first. Modern psychology recognizes similar patterns today through concepts like emotional contagion, self-fulfilling beliefs, behavioral conditioning, and subconscious expectation. The ancients simply expressed these truths symbolically through the language of vibration and energy. Their insight remains startlingly relevant. Think carefully about the money narratives repeated constantly inside your own mind. I'll never get ahead. Money always disappears. Rich people are dishonest. There's never enough. Success belongs to other people. Repeated emotionally over years, these thoughts become more than passing ideas. They become internal identity structures. And identity shapes action automatically. A person who unconsciously believes abundance is unsafe may sabotage opportunity without realizing it. Someone convinced financial struggle is permanent often stops noticing possibilities entirely. Another person may earn large amounts of money yet remain trapped psychologically in scarcity because fear dominates their consciousness regardless of circumstances. The vibration remains unchanged. This is why the Hermetic teachers emphasized mental transmutation, the deliberate shifting of inner state through awareness, discipline, and focused attention. They believed human beings possessed the ability to gradually transform emotional atmosphere internally rather than remaining prisoners of unconscious conditioning. Awareness changes frequency. A man from ancient Alexandria once sought instruction from a Hermetic teacher after years of financial instability. He complained constantly about misfortune and lack. The teacher listened patiently before asking him to describe his daily thoughts regarding money. The man spoke for several minutes. Every sentence contained fear. The teacher smiled sadly and replied, "You rehearse poverty more faithfully than abundance." That sentence pierced him deeply, because he realized scarcity had become more than circumstance. It had become identity. His internal dialogue strengthened limitation daily through repetition. Most people never notice this process happening, yet the mind obeys what it hears repeatedly, especially when emotion reinforces the message. Thoughts charged emotionally sink deeper into subconscious expectation. Eventually, behavior reorganizes itself around these assumptions automatically. This is the hidden power of vibration, not fantasy. Conditioned consciousness. So tonight, begin observing your repetitive money narratives carefully, not to shame yourself, but to awaken awareness. Listen closely to the phrases repeated inside your mind during financial stress, opportunity, uncertainty, or success. Your inner language reveals your energetic relationship with abundance. And according to the Hermetic sages, whatever relationship you rehearse consistently eventually becomes the atmosphere through which you experience reality itself. The signal becomes the structure, and the structure becomes the life. Chapter 7. Why Desperation Blocks Prosperity. An old Taoist teacher once stood beside a rushing river with a young merchant who had traveled across mountains seeking the secret of wealth. The merchant expected lessons about strategy, negotiation, or influence. Instead, the old man pointed toward the water and asked a strange question. "Have you ever seen the river force itself forward?" The merchant frowned. "No, it simply flows." The teacher nodded slowly. "And because it flows, even stone eventually yields to it." That single image contains one of the deepest financial truths hidden within ancient wisdom traditions. The Taoists believed life moves most powerfully through alignment rather than force. Yet most human beings approach money with emotional violence. They grip, chase, panic, obsess, and mentally scream at reality for immediate results. And the tighter they become internally, the narrower their perception grows. Desperation contracts awareness. This is why people trapped in financial fear often stop seeing possibilities clearly. Their nervous system becomes overwhelmed by urgency. Creativity weakens, patience disappears, judgment becomes reactive rather than intelligent. The mind shifts into survival mode, and survival mode rarely produces wisdom. Fear consumes perception. The Tao Te Ching repeatedly warns that excessive force creates resistance. Ancient sages observed this principle everywhere in nature. Pull a plant upward violently, and you destroy its roots. Force open water with your hands, and it slips away faster. Chase sleep desperately, and exhaustion intensifies. Life responds poorly to frantic grasping. Money often behaves similarly. There is a hidden psychological reason for this that ancient philosophers understood intuitively long before modern science explained it. A desperate person radiates emotional instability. Their decisions become rushed, their timing weakens. They say yes to harmful opportunities out of panic. They cling to unhealthy situations because fear of loss overwhelms clarity. Eventually, desperation becomes self-sabotage disguised as effort. A wealthy trader from ancient China once noticed something strange while traveling through crowded marketplaces. The merchants who sold the least often shouted the loudest. Their energy carried strain, urgency, and hunger. Meanwhile, the most successful traders remained remarkably calm. They spoke slowly, observed carefully, moved deliberately. The difference was not merely strategy, it was internal state. The old trader eventually concluded that people instinctively trust steadiness more than desperation. Calmness signals confidence. Panic signals instability. Even unconsciously, human beings respond differently to each emotional atmosphere. Energy communicates first. Modern psychology confirms much of this today. Under desperation, the brain narrows focus toward immediate threat reduction rather than long-term creativity. This may help survival during physical danger, but it weakens intelligent decision-making in complex financial situations. The ancients recognized this pattern through direct observation of life. A man drowning in fear cannot think expansively, and abundance often requires expansive perception. There is a reason some opportunities appear only after a person emotionally releases obsessive attachment to outcomes. The moment desperation relaxes, awareness widens again. Solutions become visible, timing improves, communication changes, relationships strengthen. The person begins acting from grounded clarity instead of frantic survival. Inner pressure dissolves, and movement returns naturally. An old Taoist story tells of an archer famous throughout the provinces for extraordinary precision. One day, a prince offered him enormous gold if he could perform before the royal court. Suddenly, the archer's hands began trembling. His breathing became unstable. His accuracy disappeared completely. Why? Because attachment replaced presence. The desire to force an outcome disrupted the natural intelligence that once guided him effortlessly. Many people unknowingly do this with money every day. They become so emotionally consumed by fear, comparison, urgency, or desperation that their natural creativity collapses beneath internal pressure. Instead of acting wisely, they begin reacting emotionally. And emotional reaction weakens perception. This is why Taoist wisdom values flow so deeply. Flow does not mean laziness or passivity. It means aligned movement without inner chaos, clear action without emotional violence, discipline without panic. Still water reflects clearly. A businessman during the Great Depression once sought counsel from an elderly philosopher after losing nearly everything. "How do I stop fearing poverty?" he asked desperately. The philosopher replied quietly, "Stop treating fear as guidance." That sentence changed him forever, because he realized most of his decisions had been controlled not by clarity, but by emotional terror. Fear had become his financial advisor. Every action emerged from avoidance rather than intelligent direction. The mind eventually becomes whatever repeatedly leads it. This is why desperate energy often repels prosperity. Not because the universe punishes need, but because desperation distorts behavior, perception, timing, and emotional presence. It clouds judgment exactly when clarity matters most. Calmness creates space for intelligence. The ancient Stoics and Taoists both understood this deeply, though they described it differently. The Stoics taught emotional self-command, the Taoists taught non-forcing. Yet both traditions pointed toward the same truth. Internal order produces stronger external outcomes. So if you wish to transform your relationship with money, begin by observing the emotional atmosphere surrounding your financial thoughts. Are you constantly chasing, panicking, comparing, gripping, catastrophizing? Or are you learning to act from steadiness? Replace urgency with clarity. Pause before financial decisions. Breathe slowly during moments of fear. Refuse to let panic become your dominant state. Remember that opportunities are often recognized not by the loudest mind, but by the clearest one. The river reaches the ocean without desperation, because flow possesses a wisdom force cannot imitate. Chapter 8. The Gospel of Thomas and Inner Wealth. He among ancient mystical writings exists a mysterious statement attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, a text buried for centuries beneath Egyptian sands before finally being rediscovered in modern times. Unlike traditional religious teachings focused heavily on external structures, this gospel spoke repeatedly about hidden transformation within human consciousness itself. One line in particular unsettled many readers deeply. "The kingdom is within you." For ancient mystics, this was not poetic symbolism alone. It was a radical psychological truth. They believed human beings endlessly searched outside themselves for power, fulfillment, abundance, and completion while remaining blind to the internal condition shaping their experience of reality from the very beginning. Inner poverty creates outer blindness. The ancient teachers observed that many people could possess opportunity all around them, yet remain unable to perceive it because scarcity already dominated their consciousness internally. Their thoughts, emotions, and expectations filtered reality through fear, insufficiency, and limitation, and perception obeys identity. A poor fisherman once traveled across the desert to seek wisdom from a teacher known for helping broken men rebuild their lives. Exhausted and bitter, the fisherman complained endlessly about his lack of money, bad fortune, and difficult circumstances. The teacher listened patiently before asking him a strange question. "If a king entered your house tonight, disguised as a beggar, would you recognize him?" The fisherman answered honestly. "Probably not." The teacher nodded. "That is how opportunity passes most people." Those words haunted him, because he slowly realized his mind had become trained to expect disappointment so completely that possibility itself felt invisible. Scarcity had become more than circumstance. It had become identity. The Gospel of Thomas repeatedly points toward this hidden blindness. Ancient mystics believed human beings carry enormous inner creative capacity, yet remain psychologically trapped by unconscious limitation. They search endlessly for external salvation, while neglecting the condition of consciousness through which they interpret all experience. The outer follows the inner. This does not mean external hardship is imaginary. The ancients were not naive about suffering. They understood poverty, injustice, and struggle intimately. But they also observed that two people could endure similar circumstances while carrying completely different internal realities. One becomes consumed by despair, the other remains inwardly alive, and over time, those internal differences begin shaping behavior, resilience, relationships, creativity, and opportunity in profound ways. An old Christian mystic once described inner wealth as the soul's remembrance that life has not abandoned it. That sentence captures something modern financial discussions often ignore completely. True abundance begins not merely with possession, but with relationship to existence itself. Some people possess money yet live internally impoverished by fear. Others possess little materially yet radiate emotional richness, generosity, clarity, and grounded confidence. The ancients believed this inner condition eventually influences outer experience because consciousness directs attention, behavior, and energy continuously. You become what you rehearse internally. There is a subtle reason inward sufficiency matters so deeply. A person psychologically starving for validation, security, or worth often seeks money compulsively as emotional rescue. But when money becomes the solution to inner emptiness, fear inevitably controls the relationship. Nothing ever feels enough. The Gospel of Thomas challenges this blindness directly. It suggests the human being already carries access to profound inner completeness, wisdom, and creative power, but remains distracted by external obsession. The tragedy is not absence of possibility. It is unconsciousness. A merchant from Alexandria once spent decades accumulating extraordinary wealth, yet remained constantly anxious about losing it. One evening, during conversation with a mystic traveler, he admitted quietly, "The more I own, the more afraid I become." The traveler replied gently, "Then wealth is possessing you." That realization shattered him. Because he understood he had spent years strengthening external abundance while neglecting internal sufficiency. Fear still ruled his consciousness regardless of material success. Yawner poverty remained untouched. The ancient mystics taught that genuine prosperity requires harmony between inner and outer life. Otherwise, abundance becomes fragile because fear, shame, insecurity, or emotional emptiness continue governing the mind beneath the surface. This is why so many wisdom traditions emphasized gratitude, stillness, self-knowledge, and disciplined thought alongside material stewardship. They understood the internal world eventually shapes the quality of the external one. Consciousness becomes atmosphere, and atmosphere influences destiny. A fascinating pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. People who cultivate inner steadiness often recognize opportunities others miss entirely. Why? Because their perception is not consumed completely by fear, resentment, desperation, or emotional chaos. Awareness remains open. The kingdom within, according to these ancient teachings, is not fantasy. It is awakened consciousness. The rediscovery of internal authority instead of psychological dependence on external conditions alone. This changes how a person moves through life. So tonight, begin cultivating inward sufficiency deliberately. Spend time each day strengthening gratitude, emotional stability, disciplined attention, and self-respect. Stop speaking to yourself constantly from lack and fear. Observe where scarcity has become identity rather than circumstance, because according to the ancient mystics, abundance first appears invisibly within consciousness long before it manifests externally in form. The blind mind overlooks open doors, but awakened awareness begins recognizing possibility everywhere. Chapter 9. The Ancient Egyptian View of Prosperity. In the candlelit chambers of ancient Egypt, long before modern banks, stock markets, or financial systems existed, priests and initiates studied a different kind of wealth entirely. To them, prosperity was not random luck granted to a chosen few. It was the visible result of alignment between the human mind and universal order. And at the center of these teachings stood a mysterious figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. Some believed he was a real man. Others believed he represented a fusion of divine wisdom traditions passed through generations of Egyptian initiates. But regardless of his historical identity, the teachings associated with him shaped centuries of mystical philosophy about consciousness, order, energy, and creation itself. The ancients believed disorder inside the mind eventually appears outside the mind. That was law. In Hermetic teachings, prosperity was deeply connected to harmony. A disciplined consciousness created disciplined action. Clear thought produced clear decisions. Internal balance generated external stability. Wealth was not viewed merely as accumulation, but as evidence of energetic order properly directed. Chaos repels multiplication. Ancient Egyptian temples reflected this principle physically. Every pillar, corridor, symbol, and proportion was carefully designed according to sacred geometry and cosmic alignment. Nothing was placed carelessly. To modern eyes, this may seem artistic or symbolic, but to the ancients, order itself carried power. Environment influenced consciousness, and consciousness influenced destiny. An old story tells of a young scribe who once entered the service of an Egyptian priest known for unusual prosperity and influence. Expecting lessons about treasure or trade, the young man instead found the priest rising before dawn each day to carefully arrange scrolls, clean sacred spaces, and organize even the smallest objects around him. Confused, the scribe finally asked, "Why spend so much attention on such ordinary things?" The priest answered quietly, "Because disorder teaches the mind disorder." That sentence contains ancient psychological wisdom. The ancients understood that external environments constantly shape internal states. A chaotic room subtly affects thought patterns. Financial disorganization weakens emotional stability. Constant clutter fragments attention. Eventually, outer confusion reinforces inner confusion until both begin feeding each other endlessly. Mental disorder becomes material disorder. Modern psychology now confirms much of this. Studies repeatedly show that cluttered environments increase stress, reduce focus, and weaken decision-making ability. The ancient Hermetic teachers discovered this through observation. Thousands of years earlier, they understood the visible and invisible mirror one another. This is why sacred prosperity in ancient Egypt involved far more than possessing wealth. It involved maintaining energetic harmony across life itself, thoughts, emotions, speech, environment, relationships, and action. Prosperity was viewed as a state of ordered consciousness reflected materially over time. A fragmented mind struggles to sustain abundance. An Egyptian merchant traveling along the Nile once became famous not merely for his wealth, but for his unusual calmness and precision. While others acted impulsively during unstable seasons, he remained deliberate and steady. His records were organized, his dealings were measured, his emotional reactions were controlled. People called him fortunate, but an older priest who knew him laughed at that description. "He is not fortunate," the priest explained. "He is ordered." That difference matters deeply. Many people desire prosperity while living internally and externally in constant disorder. Their thoughts are scattered, their emotions uncontrolled, their attention fragmented, their environment neglected, their habits inconsistent. Then they wonder why stability feels distant. The ancients would not have considered this mysterious at all, because according to Hermetic wisdom, financial chaos often reflects mental chaos first. A disorganized consciousness creates inconsistent action. Inconsistent action weakens momentum. Weak momentum limits results. Eventually, instability becomes normalized. The invisible shapes the visible. This principle appears repeatedly throughout history. Great builders, merchants, leaders, philosophers, and creators often shared one hidden characteristic: internal structure. They cultivated clarity deliberately. They respected order. They directed attention carefully instead of allowing emotional impulses to govern them continuously. Order amplifies energy. There is another layer hidden within these ancient Egyptian teachings that older wisdom traditions understood profoundly. Prosperity flows more naturally where energy can move clearly. Clutter, confusion, resentment, chronic stress, and emotional turbulence all create internal friction, and friction drains creative power. Think about how different you feel walking into a peaceful, organized environment compared to a chaotic one. One sharpens awareness, the other scatters it. The ancients believed this effect extended far beyond physical spaces into every dimension of human life. Your surroundings train your mind daily. This is why sacred temples were designed intentionally, why initiates practiced ritual cleansing, why disciplined environments were considered spiritually important. The external world was understood as an extension of consciousness itself. A businessman from Cairo once visited an elderly mystic after suffering years of financial instability. He expected mystical advice about attracting wealth. Instead, the old man walked through his home silently observing unpaid bills piled on tables, broken objects left untouched for years, scattered paperwork, neglected responsibilities, and overwhelming disorder. Finally, the mystic said softly, "Your environment is repeating your mind back to you." That realization transformed him, not overnight through magic, but gradually through awareness. As he began restoring order externally, his thinking became clearer internally. As clarity improved, decisions improved, relationships improved, timing improved, emotional overwhelm decreased. The pattern shifted because order itself carries psychological and energetic force. So tonight, look carefully at the spaces surrounding your life, your room, your desk, your finances, your routines, your thoughts. Are they reinforcing calm clarity or constant fragmentation? Organize your environment intentionally, not merely for appearance, but because according to ancient Egyptian wisdom, harmony outside strengthens harmony within, and when inner and outer order begin aligning together, prosperity no longer feels like random chance. It begins feeling natural. And if this wisdom is awakening something ancient in you, subscribe now, because the old laws were never truly lost, only forgotten. Chapter 10. The energy leak most people ignore. An old monk once told his students that a person can spend years trying to build prosperity while unknowingly draining their own life force every single day through one unconscious habit: complaining. At first, the students laughed. Surely something so ordinary could not hold such power, but the monk remained serious. He explained that repeated complaint trains the mind to rehearse helplessness constantly. Over time, this repetition reshapes emotional atmosphere, perception, behavior, and even physical energy itself. The ancients considered speech sacred for this reason. Words do not disappear after they are spoken. They shape the speaker first. Ancient monasteries across Egypt, Tibet, Greece, and the Middle East often practiced periods of disciplined silence, not merely for spiritual symbolism, but because initiates believed uncontrolled speech weakened awareness and scattered energy. Constant negativity fragmented attention. Gossip polluted perception. Chronic complaint reinforced emotional heaviness. Speech directs consciousness. Modern psychology now recognizes something remarkably similar. Repeated negative language strengthens neural pathways associated with stress, pessimism, and emotional reactivity. The brain gradually becomes conditioned toward problem fixation instead of solution awareness. The ancients observed this pattern intuitively centuries ago. A merchant from ancient Antioch became notorious throughout his city for endless complaints about money. Business was always unfair. Customers were dishonest. Taxes were unbearable. Opportunity favored others. Fortune betrayed him constantly. Strangely, even when profits improved, his complaints remained unchanged. Eventually, an old philosopher told him, "You have trained your tongue to worship scarcity." That sentence disturbed him deeply because he realized complaining had become automatic identity rather than honest observation. His speech continually reinforced emotional exhaustion, resentment, and defeat. Over time, this atmosphere shaped not only his mood but his behavior, relationships, and decisions. Negativity became environment. Many people still live this way unconsciously. They rehearse financial fear daily through constant statements like, "I'm always broke," "Nothing works out," "Money disappears instantly," or "I'll never get ahead." At first, these phrases seem harmless, but repeated emotionally over years, they become internal conditioning. Language becomes belief, belief becomes expectation, expectation shapes behavior. Ancient Hermetic teachings warned repeatedly that attention and speech magnify whatever they repeatedly energize. This does not mean difficulties should be denied dishonestly. The sages were not teaching blind positivity. They understood suffering intimately, but they also understood reinforcement. A mind trained constantly toward lack eventually becomes blind to possibility. An elderly monk living in the desert was once approached by a young man consumed by financial anxiety. The young man spoke for nearly an hour about everything wrong in his life. When he finally finished, the monk handed him a cup of water and said, "Carry this across the monastery courtyard without spilling a drop." The young man returned carefully. The monk then asked, "While protecting the water, how many complaints entered your mind?" "None," the young man admitted. The monk smiled gently. Attention determines atmosphere. That lesson stayed with him forever, because he realized complaint was not merely expression, it was focus, and whatever dominated focus gradually dominated consciousness itself. Chronic financial complaining also carries another hidden cost. It weakens personal power. The more a person rehearses helplessness verbally, the more passive and emotionally trapped they begin feeling internally. Action decreases, creativity shrinks, initiative weakens. The nervous system obeys repetition. This is why many ancient traditions emphasized disciplined speech. Stoics practiced restraint before reacting emotionally. Monks guarded words carefully. Hermetic initiates believed language carried energetic consequence. Even biblical wisdom repeatedly warns about the power of the tongue, To create life or destruction, speech shapes reality inwardly first. A businessman during the early 20th century once adopted a strange personal rule after studying ancient philosophy. For 30 days, he refused to complain verbally about money under any circumstance. Instead, whenever anxiety appeared, he redirected his focus towards solutions, gratitude, or deliberate action. The experiment changed him profoundly, not because problems vanished magically, but because his emotional energy stopped leaking constantly through habitual negativity. His mind became calmer, clearer, more resourceful. Opportunities he once overlooked suddenly became visible. Consciousness shifted, and perception followed. This does not mean pretending everything is perfect. Real hardship exists. Financial struggle can wound deeply. But the ancients understood a critical distinction between honest awareness and unconscious reinforcement. One preserves clarity, the other strengthens paralysis. So tonight, begin observing your speech carefully for the next 7 days. Notice how often financial complaints emerge automatically. Observe how certain phrases repeatedly shape your emotional state. Listen to the atmosphere your words create internally. Then begin interrupting the pattern consciously. Top habitual complaint with intentional awareness. Replace helpless repetition with grounded action. Protect your speech the way ancient initiates protected sacred fire. Because, according to the old wisdom traditions, every repeated word becomes instruction to the mind. And eventually, the mind builds reality around whatever instructions it receives most often. Chapter 11, Sowing and Reaping. In the dry fields of ancient lands, long before modern economies or digital currency, farmers understood a law so simple it became sacred across cultures. Nothing grows without being released into the soil first. You cannot harvest what you refuse to plant. This principle appears in the biblical wisdom tradition as sowing and reaping, but its meaning extends far beyond agriculture. Ancient teachers used it as a metaphor for consciousness, behavior, relationships, and prosperity itself. What you give becomes the pattern of what returns. In early Hebrew wisdom literature, this law was not framed as poetic philosophy. It was treated as practical reality. A farmer who withheld seed out of fear would eventually face famine, but one who released seed with trust and discipline would eventually witness multiplication beyond expectation. Generosity, in this sense, was not moral suggestion. It was energetic circulation. Ancient mystics observed something subtle but profound. Life responds to movement, not stagnation. Energy that is held too tightly becomes stagnant. Energy that circulates becomes fertile. Wealth behaves in a similar way. When it is treated as frozen possession, it loses its regenerative quality. When it flows wisely, it expands. This is why ancient traditions often linked generosity with prosperity rather than poverty. But there is a deeper psychological layer hidden beneath this teaching that modern readers often overlook. Generosity is not only about money, it is about identity. A man who gives from abundance signals internally that he believes there is more than enough. A man who withholds from fear signals internally that he believes scarcity is real and imminent. Over time, these internal beliefs shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. The ancient world understood this intuitively. A story from early temple traditions describes two merchants who lived in the same city and experienced vastly different fortunes over time. The first merchant hoarded everything. Even during profitable seasons, he lived in constant fear of loss. He tightened control over every coin, every decision, every interaction. The second merchant operated differently. He practiced careful generosity, Not reckless giving, but intentional circulation. He supported artisans, invested in community projects, and helped struggling families during difficult seasons. Years passed. Strangely, the second merchant's wealth increased steadily, while the first merchant's fortune slowly weakened despite constant fear-driven control. Confused observers eventually asked a temple elder how this was possible. The elder replied simply, "One man believed life was shrinking, the other behaved as if life was expanding. That distinction changes everything. Generosity, when practiced consciously, is not loss. It is participation in circulation." Ancient wisdom traditions repeatedly emphasized that energy must move to remain alive. This principle applied to money, relationships, knowledge, emotion, and opportunity. Hoarding from fear interrupts flow, and interrupted flow eventually weakens the system itself. Stoic philosophy adds another layer to this understanding. Seneca, one of the wealthiest Stoic philosophers of Rome, often wrote about the paradox of possession. He observed that people who cling tightly to wealth out of fear often become psychologically poorer than those who use wealth wisely with clarity and detachment. Fear creates inner contraction, and contraction limits perception. A contracted mind sees fewer possibilities. It becomes obsessed with protection rather than creation. It evaluates life through the lens of loss instead of potential. Even when opportunity appears, it is often misinterpreted as risk. Fear distorts intelligence. Ancient teachings from both biblical wisdom and Stoic philosophy converge on a shared insight. Stewardship matters more than possession. What you do with what you have determines what you become capable of receiving. The farmer who buries seed in fear of loss misunderstands nature itself. The seed must die in the soil before it becomes multiplication. Release is not destruction, it is transformation. This metaphor applies directly to financial consciousness. A person who hoards everything out of insecurity often unconsciously signals scarcity to their own mind. They reinforce internal narratives of lack, instability, and threat. Over time, this emotional conditioning shapes decision-making, risk perception, and opportunity recognition. Generosity interrupts that cycle, not blindly but intentionally. Even small acts of giving, time, attention, resources, encouragement, can begin reshaping internal identity from scarcity-based thinking toward abundance-based awareness. The key is not magnitude, it is consciousness. Ancient teachers understood that wealth flows more easily through open systems than closed ones. A closed hand cannot receive, but generosity does not mean recklessness. The ancient wisdom traditions always distinguished between wise stewardship and emotional impulsivity. Giving from clarity strengthens structure. Giving from fear weakens stability. The difference lies in intention. One originates from abundance, the other from anxiety. And life responds differently to each. If this teaching feels uncomfortable, it may be because scarcity conditioning runs deeper than conscious awareness. Many people were raised in environments where survival required holding tightly to everything. Over time, this conditioning becomes emotional reflex. Letting go feels unsafe. But ancient wisdom invites a deeper reflection. Is holding on truly protecting you, or is it silently reinforcing the belief that loss is inevitable? This is where transformation begins, with awareness. So today, observe your relationship with giving carefully. Notice whether your decisions are driven by trust or fear. Pay attention to moments where withholding comes from anxiety rather than wisdom. Recognize where generosity might be possible without destabilizing your life. Begin small if necessary, but begin consciously. Because according to ancient wisdom traditions, what you circulate with awareness does not diminish you. It expands your participation in the flow of life itself. And what participates in flow multiplies. Chapter 12, The Psychology of Scarcity. Scarcity does not begin in the world. It begins in perception. Long before a person experiences financial limitation externally, they often begin experiencing it internally as a psychological lens through which reality is filtered. This lens quietly reshapes attention, interpretation, emotion, and decision-making. Ancient teachers warned about this subtle distortion long before modern psychology gave it a name. They simply called it fear. But fear is not just an emotion, it is a narrowing force. It compresses awareness into survival focus. It reduces cognitive flexibility, it limits imagination, and most importantly, it trains the mind to prioritize threat over possibility. A mind in scarcity does not see clearly, it sees selectively. Modern cognitive science now confirms what ancient wisdom traditions observed intuitively. When the brain is focused on lack or threat, it consumes more mental bandwidth, leaving fewer resources available for creative thinking, long-term planning, and strategic decision-making. In simpler terms, scarcity makes intelligence smaller. Ancient warnings about fear-based living often appear in philosophical texts disguised as moral teaching. Stoics warned that fear enslaves judgment. Biblical wisdom repeatedly cautions against anxiety-driven thinking. Taoist philosophy emphasizes that tension disrupts natural flow. Different languages, same observation. A man living in scarcity consciousness often believes he is responding rationally to reality. In truth, he is often responding to internal fear projections rather than objective conditions. This is why two people in identical circumstances can experience entirely different realities. One sees possibility, the other sees limitation. Ancient mystics believed perception itself is shaped by inner state before external fact is ever processed. In this view, scarcity is not merely a condition of having less. It is a state of interpreting life through contraction rather than expansion. This contraction affects behavior in subtle ways. A person operating from scarcity tends to over-control small details while missing larger opportunities. They may become overly cautious, excessively protective, or emotionally reactive to uncertainty. Even when opportunities appear, hesitation dominates decision-making. Fear replaces flow. There is a powerful ancient story from desert traditions about a traveler who lost his wealth during a long journey. Alone and exhausted, he became consumed by thoughts of permanent failure. Every decision began to feel dangerous. Every possibility seemed risky. He stopped trusting his own judgment. Eventually, he met an old hermit who listened quietly to his story. After a long silence, the hermit said, "You are not lost because you have no wealth. You are lost because you believe loss is your identity." That insight shifted everything, because scarcity is not just about resources. It becomes identity when repeated long enough. Once internalized, it begins shaping interpretation of every event. Even neutral situations begin to feel threatening. Even opportunities begin to feel unsafe. This is the psychology of scarcity. It is not reality itself. It is interpretation under fear. Ancient initiates trained themselves to observe this distortion carefully. They understood that breaking scarcity perception required awareness before action. Without awareness, action often reinforces the same pattern. A person in scarcity may earn more money, yet still feel poor internally. They may achieve success, yet remain anxious about loss. They may accumulate resources, yet never experience inner sufficiency, because the lens remains unchanged. This is why ancient wisdom traditions emphasized mental discipline, emotional regulation, gratitude, and conscious attention. These were not abstract virtues. They were methods of correcting distorted perception. A fragmented mind cannot recognize abundance clearly. Only a stabilized mind can. So begin noticing the phrase "not enough" as it appears in your thinking, not only in finances, but in time, energy, opportunity, and relationships. Observe how often the mind predicts lack before evidence appears. Watch how fear subtly narrows your sense of possibility. Do not judge it, just observe it, because awareness itself begins weakening the pattern. Scarcity loses power when it is seen clearly. And according to ancient psychological wisdom, what is seen without identification begins to dissolve. When the lens changes, reality begins to open. Chapter 13. Wealth and Self-Identity. A man once sat beside a river in an ancient trading city, watching merchants move gold, grain, and silk across the docks. He had worked harder than most of them, longer hours, harsher conditions, deeper sacrifice. Yet somehow he always remained behind. When asked why, he answered with a sentence that sounded harmless at first: "I never have enough." He did not realize that this was not just a statement. It was a self-definition. Ancient wisdom traditions would have called this identity-based prophecy, because over time, what a person repeatedly affirms emotionally becomes the structure through which they interpret reality. Not because words alone create gold, but because words shape expectation, and expectation shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. In Hermetic and Stoic traditions alike, identity was considered the hidden engine behind destiny. Ancient initiates understood something modern thinking often overlooks. People do not act consistently according to reality. They act consistently according to who they believe they are within reality. This is why two individuals can face the same financial environment and produce completely different results. One person sees temporary setback as information. The other sees it as confirmation of personal inadequacy. One adapts. The other withdraws. Identity filters experience before logic ever intervenes. A story from an ancient mystery school in Egypt describes a young apprentice who struggled constantly with prosperity. He studied diligently, worked carefully, followed instructions precisely, but his life remained unstable. Frustrated, he asked the elder initiates for guidance. They did not give him strategy. Instead, they asked him to repeat a simple phrase every morning before sunrise: "I am someone who lacks." At first he resisted. It felt wrong. But the teachers insisted he observe his own mind carefully while repeating it. Within days, something shifted, but not in the way he expected. He began noticing how often he already lived from that identity unconsciously. Every hesitation, every fearful decision, every assumption of failure, every avoidance of opportunity, it all stemmed from a silent internal narrative of lack. The phrase did not create the identity, it revealed it. And that revelation became the turning point. The initiates then guided him through a process of gradually replacing internal language, not through blind affirmation, but through conscious reconstruction of self-perception. Instead of "I lack," he began observing thoughts like "I am learning to manage resources wisely." Instead of "I never have enough," he shifted toward "I am becoming someone who handles value with clarity." Slowly his decisions changed. And as his decisions changed, his outcomes followed. Ancient teachings consistently emphasize this principle. Self-image precedes financial behavior. A person who unconsciously sees themselves as incapable of stability will make subtle choices that reinforce instability, not because they desire failure, but because their identity quietly guides interpretation and action. Even opportunities are filtered through identity. A person who believes, "This is not for me," will often overlook or sabotage opportunities that require a different self-concept. Meanwhile, someone with a stable internal identity will recognize possibilities earlier, act more decisively, and persist longer through difficulty. The outer world becomes a reflection of internal narrative continuity. This is why ancient wisdom traditions placed enormous importance on internal language. In biblical texts, identity is repeatedly reshaped through naming, calling, and covenant language. In Hermetic teachings, thought is considered the blueprint of experience. In Stoic philosophy, self-command begins with self-definition. Modern psychology now echoes this through studies on self-schema and cognitive identity loops, but ancient initiates practiced it experientially. They understood that changing life conditions without changing self-concept produces temporary shifts at best. The deeper pattern remains intact. True transformation begins when identity itself is rewritten at the level of thought, emotion, and internal repetition. A merchant from Alexandria once experienced a dramatic shift in fortune after years of instability. When asked what changed, he did not mention strategy or luck. Instead, he said something unusual. "I stopped speaking to myself like a man waiting to fail." That sentence captures the essence of this chapter. Most people unconsciously rehearse limitation internally throughout the day, not always verbally, but emotionally. Through worry, through anticipation of loss, through imagined failure scenarios, through self-doubt. Over time, these repetitions become identity reinforcement cycles, and identity becomes the invisible architect of behavior. So the ancient instruction is not to force positivity, but to observe internal language with precision. Notice how often thoughts reinforce limitation. Notice how frequently identity aligns with lack rather than capability. Then begin the slow process of interruption, not suppression, reconstruction, because according to ancient initiates, you do not change your financial life by fighting circumstances first. You change it by transforming the identity interpreting those circumstances, and once identity shifts, behavior follows naturally, and behavior reshapes destiny. Chapter 14. The Discipline of Attention. In the crowded markets of ancient cities, there was a subtle difference between those who prospered and those who remained lost in constant struggle. It was not always intelligence, not always effort, not always even opportunity, it was attention. An old Stoic philosopher once observed that the human mind is not destroyed by lack of resources, but by scattered awareness. He compared attention to currency, not because it could be spent like money, but because it determines where life force is invested at every moment. Whatever holds attention begins to grow. Ancient traditions from Stoicism to Taoism to Hermetic teachings consistently return to this principle. Attention directs energy, and energy, when directed repeatedly, becomes structure. Structure becomes habit. Habit becomes outcome. In simpler terms, attention builds reality gradually. Most people underestimate this because attention feels effortless, but internally, it is one of the most powerful forces shaping experience. What you repeatedly observe mentally becomes what your brain prioritizes. What your brain prioritizes becomes what you emotionally react to. What you emotionally react to becomes what you act upon. Attention is the first step in creation. An ancient story tells of a young man training under a desert teacher known for extraordinary mental discipline. The teacher would often assign seemingly simple tasks, but each required intense awareness. One day he told the student to sit near a busy caravan path and simply observe everything without reacting for 1 hour. The student returned overwhelmed. "I saw too much," he said. "Too many movements, too many voices, too many distractions." The teacher nodded. "That is your mind." The lesson was not about external noise. It was about internal fragmentation. The ancients believed that a scattered mind leaks energy constantly. Every unnecessary thought, reaction, judgment, or emotional drift pulls awareness away from creation and into reactivity. Over time, this weakens the ability to recognize meaningful opportunities. Attention becomes diluted, and diluted attention cannot build anything stable. Modern life intensifies this condition. Constant notifications, emotional media cycles, endless comparison, and rapid information consumption fragment awareness into smaller and smaller pieces. The result is a mind that reacts quickly but rarely observes deeply. Ancient initiates would have recognized this immediately as energetic depletion. They would say, "Your attention is being spent without awareness." A person cannot build wealth, material or internal, if their attention is constantly scattered across emotional noise, because every shift of focus carries micro costs in clarity, presence, and decision quality. What you repeatedly notice becomes what you repeatedly reinforce. This is why focus was treated as a form of spiritual discipline in many ancient traditions. Monks trained attention through silence. Stoics trained it through reflection. Hermetic initiates trained it through observation of thought itself. They understood a simple truth. Where attention goes, perception organizes, and where perception organizes, action follows. A merchant in ancient Greece once discovered this principle accidentally. After losing his fortune in a failed trade, he began studying his own mental habits instead of immediately rushing into new ventures. He noticed something disturbing. His attention constantly drifted toward fear-based predictions, past failures, and imagined losses. Rarely did it remain with present opportunity, so he began training it deliberately. Each day he would redirect his focus whenever it drifted into fear or regret. Not with force, but with awareness. Over time, his mind became less reactive, more stable, more observant, and something unexpected happened. He began noticing opportunities he previously overlooked entirely. Conversations became clearer, risks became more measurable, decisions became more strategic. His external results changed only after his internal attention patterns shifted. Nothing outside had changed first. Everything inside had reorganized. This is the hidden discipline of ancient wisdom traditions. Protect attention as if it is the foundation of creation itself. Because in many ways, attention is not passive. It is directional force. And in a world designed to fragment it constantly, the ability to hold it steadily becomes a form of inner sovereignty. So begin observing where your attention goes throughout the day, not to judge it, but to understand it. Notice how often it is pulled toward fear, comparison, distraction, or emotional reaction. Then gently redirect it toward clarity, intention, and presence. Even small corrections matter, because attention does not transform through intensity alone, but through repetition. And over time, what you consistently attend to becomes the structure of your lived reality. Chapter 15. The Law of Cause and Effect. In the old Hermetic temples of Egypt, there was a teaching carved into stone that was not meant to comfort, it was meant to awaken. It said, in essence, that nothing enters the human experience without cause, not even fortune, not even loss, not even the smallest shift in circumstance. To the untrained eye, life appears random. A sudden opportunity appears. A sudden setback arrives. A door opens without warning, another closes without explanation. But the initiates of the ancient Hermetic schools taught something different beneath the surface of appearances. Nothing is truly random, only unseen in its origin. The principle known in Hermetic philosophy as cause and effect suggests that every visible condition is preceded by invisible activity. Not necessarily dramatic action, but subtle, repeated, often unnoticed patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior that accumulate over time until they crystallize into experience. A man does not wake up suddenly in financial chaos. He walks into it gradually through 1,000 small decisions he did not consider important at the time. Likewise, prosperity rarely arrives as a singular miracle. It is often the result of disciplined repetition that went unnoticed long before it became visible success. Ancient teachers would often say, "The present is the shadow of yesterday's invisible habits." There is a story preserved in fragments of early Hermetic lore about a young apprentice who once complained to his master about his lack of progress in life. He said, "I have tried to change my fate, but nothing changes. The world remains the same." The master took him to a garden where two identical trees grew side by side. One was strong, tall, and bearing fruit. The other was weak and barren. The apprentice asked why they were different if they came from the same soil. The master replied, "One was tended daily, the other was ignored daily. The difference is not sudden, it is accumulated." That is the essence of cause and effect. Invisible repetition becomes visible destiny. Modern life often obscures this principle because it favors dramatic explanations. People prefer to believe outcomes are caused by sudden events, luck, opportunity, timing, or external forces. But ancient wisdom insists on a deeper layer, the slow accumulation of small causes. A financial life, for example, is not shaped primarily by one large decision. It is shaped by repeated patterns of attention, spending, saving, reacting, and delaying. Each moment is a seed. Most people never notice what they are planting. Stoic philosophy aligns closely with this understanding. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on how internal discipline shapes external life. Not through force, but through consistent alignment of thought and action. He understood that character itself is built through repetition, and circumstance follows character like a shadow follows form. Hermetic teachings extend this even further. Thought itself is causal, not in a magical sense, but in a structural one. Thoughts influence perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior influences environment. Environment reinforces thought. A loop is formed, and within that loop, most people live unconsciously. The ancient initiates would therefore begin training not with grand external changes, but with microscopic internal discipline. They would observe the smallest impulses, impulsive reactions, habitual fears, repeated assumptions about money, stability, and opportunity, because they understood something critical. If you cannot govern the smallest causes, you cannot shape the larger effects. A merchant in ancient Phoenicia once believed he was cursed with misfortune. Every venture he touched seemed to collapse. He sought guidance from a traveling Hermetic teacher who simply observed his daily routine for several days without speaking. After watching silently, the teacher said only one thing: "You do not trust what you build, so you undo it while building it." The merchant did not understand at first, but over time he realized the truth. Every time uncertainty appeared, he would sabotage his own progress through hesitation, withdrawal, or premature abandonment. The collapse of his ventures was not sudden, it was self-generated through repeated micro-decisions. Invisible causes had been shaping visible failure, When he began correcting these small patterns, staying consistent through discomfort, resisting impulsive retreat, maintaining discipline during uncertainty, his external results slowly shifted, not immediately, but inevitably. That is the law of cause and effect in lived reality. It does not respond to desire alone. It responds to structure. And structure is built through repetition. So the ancient instruction is simple but demanding. Pay attention to the smallest actions that feel insignificant. The way you respond to stress, the way you handle uncertainty, the way you speak about money when no one is listening, the way you interpret small setbacks. These are not minor behaviors. They are causal seeds, and over time, they accumulate into outcomes that feel sudden only to those who were not observing closely. The master key of this principle is awareness of repetition, because what repeats without awareness becomes destiny without consent. Chapter 16, The Taoist Secret of Flow. In the philosophy of ancient Taoism, there is an image that appears again and again across generations. Water not as a symbol of weakness, but of intelligence. Water does not argue with obstacles. It does not force its path. It does not resist the shape of the world it moves through. And yet, over time, nothing withstands it. Mountains are reshaped, stones are softened, entire landscapes are transformed, not through aggression, but through persistent adaptability. Ancient Taoist sages observed this and drew a profound conclusion. What is flexible survives. What is rigid breaks. This principle, known in Taoist wisdom as flow, is not passive surrender. It is intelligent responsiveness. It is the ability to move with conditions rather than against them, to adjust without losing direction, and to remain effective without becoming emotionally rigid. In financial life, this principle becomes especially important. Many people mistake control for rigidity. They attempt to force outcomes, lock expectations, and resist change. But life, like water, does not respond well to pressure without adaptation. It shifts around resistance, often redirecting opportunity away from those who insist on controlling every variable. The paradox is simple. The more rigid the mind, the fewer pathways it perceives. The more fluid the mind, the more options it recognizes. Ancient Taoist texts such as the Tao Te Ching repeatedly emphasize that effortlessness is not laziness. It is alignment with natural order. Action that arises from flow tends to require less force and produce more sustainable results. A story is told of an old fisherman who lived by a river that constantly changed course. Younger fishermen would complain bitterly whenever the river shifted, saying it ruined their plans and destroyed their expectations. They would dig channels, build rigid systems, and attempt to control where the water should go. But the old fisherman did something different. He adapted. When the river shifted, he shifted. When fish patterns changed, he adjusted his timing. When conditions altered, he observed first before acting. Over time, while others struggled against the changing river, he continued to thrive within it. One day, a frustrated fisherman asked him, "How do you keep succeeding when everything keeps changing?" The old man replied simply, "I stopped arguing with water. That is the essence of flow, not resistance, not control, but participation." Stoic philosophy intersects with this Taoist principle in an unexpected way. While Stoicism emphasizes inner discipline, Taoism emphasizes natural alignment. Together, they form a powerful synthesis. Inner stability without external rigidity, calm awareness combined with adaptive action. In this balance, life becomes less of a struggle and more of a responsive movement. Financially, this means understanding that opportunities do not always appear in expected forms. Markets shift, conditions change. circumstances evolve. Those who cling rigidly to one method of success often miss emerging pathways simply because they are not identical to previous ones. Flow requires psychological flexibility. It requires the ability to remain calm when outcomes differ from expectations and to adjust behavior without emotional collapse. Ancient sages understood that rigidity is often rooted in fear, the fear of uncertainty, loss or lack of control. But water teaches a different lesson. Uncertainty is not danger, it is movement, and movement contains possibility. A rigid mind says, "This should not be happening." A flowing mind asks, "What is now possible here?" That single shift changes perception entirely. When you apply this principle to money, work, and opportunity, something subtle begins to change. Instead of reacting defensively to change, you begin observing it as information. Instead of resisting shifts in circumstances, you begin adapting intelligently within them. You stop fighting the river and start moving with it. Taoist wisdom does not promise control over external reality. It teaches something deeper, the ability to remain effective within it, regardless of conditions. This is why adaptability was considered a higher form of intelligence in ancient traditions, not because it eliminates difficulty, but because it transforms difficulty into movement rather than obstruction. So observe where rigidity appears in your life, where expectations feel fixed, where resistance builds when things change unexpectedly. Notice where emotional tension arises from the desire for control rather than understanding. Then gently practice fluid response, not surrender, not force, but movement, because according to ancient Taoist insight, life does not reward control as much as it rewards alignment, and those who learn to flow rarely break. Chapter 17, The Return to Financial Authority. There comes a moment in every person's life when money stops feeling like numbers on a screen or coins in a pocket and starts revealing something deeper, something almost personal. Not alive in a literal sense, but responsive, as if it is reflecting the way you relate to existence itself. Ancient traditions often spoke of wealth not as possession, but as relationship. A dynamic exchange between human consciousness and the movement of energy through the world. In Hermetic thought, nothing exists in isolation. Everything participates in correspondence, vibration, and cause. From this perspective, money is not separate from life. It is one of the most visible expressions of how energy flows through decisions, discipline, emotion, and attention. When that flow is unstable internally, it becomes unstable externally. When that flow is ordered internally, external life begins to reflect coherence. A forgotten teaching from early Egyptian mystery traditions described prosperity as aligned stewardship of invisible energy. Not simply acquiring wealth, but becoming someone capable of holding it without distortion, without fear, chaos, or unconscious misuse, because in those traditions receiving was never the ultimate test, sustaining was, and sustaining required internal structure. There is an old story passed through initiatory lineages about a man who sought financial mastery. He was not lazy, he was not ignorant, he studied trade, worked diligently, and even experienced periods of success. Yet every time prosperity arrived, it eventually slipped away. Confused, he sought counsel from an elder who lived outside the city, someone known for understanding unseen principles rather than visible systems. The elder did not ask about his income, his profession, or his strategy. Instead, he asked a simple question: "Are you trustworthy with what flows through you?" The man did not understand. "I have always worked hard," he replied. The elder nodded gently. Hard work is not the same as trustworthiness with energy. He then explained something that became the turning point of the man's understanding. Money does not only respond to effort, it responds to consistency, emotional stability, and internal order. If a person cannot hold clarity during receiving, they cannot maintain stability during expansion. In modern terms, we might say, financial outcomes reflect psychological structure. In ancient terms, they would say, you are given what you are capable of sustaining. Stoic philosophy echoes this idea in a different language. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly emphasized that external circumstances are less important than internal governance. A person who cannot govern their reactions cannot govern outcomes. A mind that collapses under emotional turbulence cannot hold responsibility without distortion. This is why financial authority begins internally. Not in accumulation, but in coherence. A scattered mind treats money as survival pressure. A stable mind treats money as energy in motion. A fearful mind reacts impulsively. A grounded mind responds consciously. Over time, these differences accumulate into entirely different life trajectories. Internal order is not a luxury, it is a prerequisite for stability in any form of prosperity. Ancient wisdom traditions consistently emphasize this point. If you want to understand your external world, first observe the structure of your internal responses. Do you panic when uncertainty appears? Do you chase when opportunity feels scarce? Do you withdraw when expansion becomes possible? These reactions are not minor. They are indicators of how energy moves through your system. And in Hermetic understanding, energy always seeks expression, so if internal energy is chaotic, external life reflects that chaos in patterns that appear as instability, unpredictability, or repeated cycles of loss and recovery. But when internal energy becomes coherent, when thought, emotion, and action begin to align, something remarkable happens. External life begins to stabilize not because the world changes first, but because your interaction with it becomes consistent. This is financial authority, not control over money, but mastery over your relationship with it. A traveler in ancient caravan traditions once observed that two merchants could travel the same routes, face the same risks, and encounter the same markets, but consistently produce different outcomes over time. One merchant was reactive, shifting strategies based on fear and short-term emotion. The other was steady, adjusting with awareness but never collapsing into panic. The difference was not intelligence. It was internal consistency. One treated money as unpredictable threat, the other treated it as structured flow. Over time, their realities diverged, because reality responds less to intention alone and more to the stability of the system interpreting it. So returning to financial authority is not about domination over resources. It is about restoring alignment within yourself so that external resources no longer destabilize your internal state. You become the anchor, not the reaction. You become the observer of flow, not the victim of fluctuation, and in that state, decisions become clearer. Timing becomes more natural, emotional interference decreases. Opportunities become easier to recognize because perception is no longer clouded by fear-based distortion. The ancients would say, when the vessel is stable, what flows into it is no longer lost. This is the beginning of mastery, not wealth accumulation, but energetic reliability. And from that reliability, everything else begins to reorganize itself. Chapter 18. The Final Energy Law. Across ancient schools, from Hermetic temples in Egypt to Stoic halls in Rome to contemplative traditions in the East, there is a final, uncomfortable insight that only becomes visible after all other illusions are stripped away. Humanity is not poor because the world is withholding abundance. Humanity is often unstable because consciousness has been conditioned to interpret life through scarcity. This conditioning is not always personal. It is cultural, historical, and psychological. It is absorbed through language, family patterns, social environments, and repeated emotional reinforcement. Over time, it becomes invisible, like background noise that shapes perception without being noticed. But ancient teachers insisted on one radical correction. What you repeatedly assume internally becomes the structure through which life is experienced externally, not as superstition, but as perception organizing reality into familiar patterns. The Hermetic principle, often summarized as the all is mind, does not suggest fantasy control over physical reality. It points to something more subtle and far more important. Consciousness is the framework through which reality is interpreted, filtered, and responded to. Therefore, change begins not with circumstance, but with awareness of internal state. A person who assumes lack will interpret even neutral events as limitation. A person who assumes sufficiency will interpret similar events as potential. The events themselves may be identical, but the meaning extracted from them differs dramatically. Meaning becomes destiny over time. This is why ancient initiatory traditions placed such emphasis on observation of mind. Not control in the aggressive sense, but witnessing, because only what is observed clearly can be transformed consciously. Without observation, patterns repeat automatically, and repetition becomes identity, and identity becomes experience. This is the hidden architecture behind what many traditions call creation, not sudden manifestation, but continuous interpretation shaping continuous behavior. Nowhere is this more evident than in financial experience. Money is rarely just numbers, it is emotional symbolism. It carries meaning about safety, worth, possibility, and control. That is why two individuals with similar income levels can experience completely different emotional realities. One feeling secure, the other constantly anxious. The difference is internal interpretation, not external condition. This is where the final instruction emerges from ancient wisdom traditions. Observe your consciousness as it relates to money without interruption for a sustained period. Not to fix it immediately, but to see it clearly. For 30 days, the teaching suggests, observe 3 layers without judgment. Thoughts about money as they arise. Emotional reactions when money is gained, lost, spent, or considered. Behavioral impulses when financial decisions appear. This is not a financial exercise, it is a consciousness audit, because what you observe repeatedly begins to lose unconscious control over you. Patterns that were automatic become visible, and what becomes visible can no longer operate in the background unnoticed. Ancient mystics believed this moment of awareness is where transformation begins, not through force, but through clarity. A story from contemplative tradition describes a student who spent years attempting to fix his life through external effort. More work, more discipline, more strategy. Yet nothing fundamentally changed. One day, his teacher stopped him and said, "You are trying to change shadows while ignoring the light casting them." That single statement reframed everything, because external financial reality is often a shadow of internal energetic structure, and until the structure is observed, the shadow continues repeating familiar shapes. The final law, then, is not about control. It is about correspondence, where attention stabilizes, perception organizes. Where perception organizes, behavior aligns. Where behavior aligns, outcomes follow, not instantly, but inevitably. And this brings us to the concluding truth preserved across multiple ancient traditions in different forms. What controls your consciousness controls your reality. Not as metaphor, but as lived structure. So the final challenge is simple, but not easy. Observe, not occasionally, not selectively, but consistently enough to see the pattern beneath the pattern, because once you see it clearly, you can no longer unsee it. And at that point, life stops being something that simply happens to you, and becomes something you are finally conscious of participating in.